What happens when a country where more than 45% of the population depends on agriculture opens its market wider to the world's largest economy? This video examines why thousands of Indian farmers are back on the streets after a new trade agreement with the United States reduced tariffs on American goods, and why the consequences could extend far beyond rural India. The stakes are not limited to crop prices, they touch elections, supply chains, and the balance between domestic protection and global integration. If this confrontation escalates, India could face renewed nationwide farm unrest similar to the 2020-2021 protests that lasted more than a year and force the government into a rare policy reversal. If it fails to gain traction, New Delhi may accelerate trade liberalization as part of a broader economic strategy tied to manufacturing growth and strategic alignment with Washington. At its core, the dispute is about who absorbs the shock of tariff cuts: small farmers operating on fragmented land holdings, or consumers and exporters seeking competitive access to global markets. The agreement announced last week commits India to eliminate or reduce tariffs on all US industrial goods and selected food and agricultural products. In return, the United States will impose a reciprocal tariff rate of 18% on a range of Indian exports, including textiles, apparel, leather goods, footwear, plastics, rubber products, organic chemicals, and certain machinery. While not a full free trade agreement, the arrangement adjusts tariff structures in ways that could reshape trade flows between the world's fifth largest economy and the United States, its largest trading partner in goods. Farmer unions have described the deal as capitulation to large American agribusiness interests, arguing that reduced tariffs could expose Indian producers to cheaper imports. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government has countered by stating that sensitive sectors such as dairy and poultry remain outside the scope of concessions. Officials have attempted to reassure rural constituencies that core protections are intact. Yet skepticism persists, rooted in the structure of Indian agriculture itself. India's farm sector supports over 45% of its 1.4 billion people, but contributes less than 1/5 of gross domestic product. Average land holdings are small, often under 2 hectares, and productivity varies widely across states. Many farmers rely on minimum support prices, procurement systems, fertilizer subsidies, and state intervention to stabilize income. For decades, successive governments have shielded agriculture from external competition, reflecting both economic vulnerability and political leverage. Rural voters form a decisive electoral bloc, capable of sustained mobilization. The protests on Thursday unfolded across multiple cities. Organizers circulated images showing several thousand participants carrying union flags and banners. Minor scuffles with police were reported in some areas, though the gatherings did not approach the scale of previous national agitations. Opposition leader Rahul Gandhi expressed support for the farmers, framing their concerns as fears that trade agreements could undermine livelihoods. His intervention underscores how trade policy in India is inseparable from domestic political rivalry, particularly with general elections never far from the horizon. To understand the intensity of the reaction, it is necessary to revisit the events of 2020 and 2021. The government introduced 3 agricultural reform laws intended to liberalize marketing channels and attract private investment. Farmers, particularly from Punjab and Haryana, argued the changes would weaken price guarantees and leave them exposed to corporate buyers. Months of protests followed. Highways into New Delhi were blocked, tens of thousands camped at border points, and in January 2021, some demonstrators entered the Red Fort complex on tractors. After more than a year of deadlock, the government repealed the laws. That episode demonstrated the capacity of rural movements to force policy reversals even under a strong central administration. The new trade agreement arrives against a different global backdrop. India is positioning itself as an alternative manufacturing hub amid supply chain diversification and geopolitical tensions between Washington and Beijing. Closer economic ties with the United States support that strategy, particularly in sectors such as semiconductors, defense technology, and clean energy. Reducing tariffs on industrial goods aligns with India's ambition to integrate more deeply into global value chains. However, agriculture remains politically sensitive, and even partial tariff adjustments can trigger anxiety. What if scenario 1? If reduced tariffs lead to a measurable increase in US agricultural imports that undercut domestic prices, farmer incomes could decline in key states. That could reignite large-scale mobilization, pressure state governments, and compel New Delhi to reconsider aspects of the agreement. Such a reversal would signal limits to India's trade liberalization agenda and potentially complicate its economic diplomacy with Washington. It would also reinforce the perception that agricultural reform in India is structurally constrained by political economy realities. What if scenario 2? If the exclusions for dairy, poultry, and other sensitive products prove sufficient to shield core constituencies, and if industrial gains from expanded US market access offset localized agricultural pressures, the protests may dissipate. In that case, India could proceed with incremental tariff rationalization, strengthening bilateral trade that already exceeds $100 billion annually. That outcome would deepen strategic alignment between the two democracies at a time when both seek to counterbalance China's regional influence. The tension reflects a broader dilemma faced by emerging economies: balancing rural stability with global competitiveness. India's leadership must manage inflation, rural employment, and export growth simultaneously. An 18% reciprocal tariff from the United States on selected Indian goods introduces its own pressures, particularly for labor-intensive sectors such as textiles and footwear that employ millions. Trade negotiations thus become a complex exchange of concessions across constituencies, not a simple opening of borders. Regionally, sustained unrest could affect South Asia's economic trajectory. India anchors regional supply chains and influences trade norms across neighboring countries. Globally, the episode will be watched as a test of how democratic systems reconcile domestic dissent with strategic trade partnerships. For Washington, the agreement is part of a wider effort to solidify economic ties in the Indo-Pacific. For New Delhi, it is a calculation about long-term growth, strategic autonomy, and electoral risk.